Picture this. You're at some theatre watching a Shakespeare comedy. They deliver one of those silly lines like,
"If it had been painful, I would not have come."
You take pleasure, then? In the message.
and everyone starts cracking up laughing. Ha ha ha. You think, come on, it wasn't that funny, but you're all laughing just so that everyone else can see that you understood the 16th century joke, even if it wasn't all that funny to begin with. This is the kind of insufferable performative behaviour that the internet is right to declare war on. Or is it? After all, the joke was written to be funny, albeit to people hundreds of years ago. The actors, together with the director, have rehearsed and delivered the line in a way that's crafted to get a laugh. The audience has just responded the way that the creators of this moment, living and dead, wanted them to. Besides, even if you were impressed that the strangers in the audience had laughed at an Elizabethan joke, it wouldn't make any difference. It has no material effect on the world whether you're impressed or disdainful of that. And that's not even getting into the fact that most of Shakespeare's jokes are just dick jokes and other lewd sex stuff. I'm just saying, if laughing at this is intellectual, then it's really only intellectual by association. And this is why I'm declaring a jihad against the word performative. The obsession with identifying who is performative and who isn't, all this rage and scorn is in service of nothing, points towards no useful end. It inevitably leads to the conclusion that the only possible prescription is not to read, not to wear bookshop tote bags, or really do anything that could risk identifying you as performative, like, making a video for the internet about how the word performative is stupid. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Sandy is just making this video to try and beat the performative male allegations, which really should get him dead to rights. And, well...
You got me.
But what exactly is performative behaviour? Well, like a lot of these trendy insults, performative essentially just means false or phony, just like how virtue signalling means phony, and pretentious also means phony. It's an accusation of insincerity, behaviour that serves some secret secondary purpose other than the one it on the surface does. I became aware of this when that stupid performative reading blow-up happened. The idea, of course, is that if you're performatively reading on the tube, you're reading, or at least pretending to read, not because you actually enjoy reading, that'd be ridiculous, but because you think that it'll impress people. Will send a signal to the other commuters on their way to employment hell that you're a reader, and therefore of a higher class than everyone who is mindlessly doom-scrolling away their time. I'm not bothering to point out that the word performative, as coined by the philosopher Judith Butler, meant something completely different, because sadly, that battle is lost. Performative speech, as defined by Judith Butler, was an actually useful concept, whereas this endless labeling of everything we don't like as performative is just childish. Performative reading, performative laughing, performative activism, performative feminism, performative anti-racism, the list goes on. On one level, there's a sort of conspiratorial worldview at play here. Other people behaving in a way that I don't like or understand, or even in a way that's just different from me, must mean they are faking it for some other secret purpose. But there's also an element of projection here. People who obsess over whether or not other people's actions are performative or not accidentally reveal their own insecurities. Because they think a lot about how they are perceived by people in public, they assume that everyone else must be equally concerned, and must be constantly adjusting their behaviour in order to avoid judgment. That's right, I just Uno reversed the Performativity Watchers. The Performativity Watchers are, in fact, performative. I actually considered making a video like this right at the start of my channel, but I figured that the performative male and performative female memes were just a silly trend that's mostly a joke anyway, and I didn't want to be the person who gets riled up over internet memes in a world where there are so many genuinely awful things to get riled up over. So I went about my life assuming that it was in fact largely a joke. But it went on, people calling every little thing performative. And at a certain point I realized that many people are being very serious about all this. One video I watched by a popular creator said that it feels illegal to start a book on public transport because it looks performative. As if anyone else cared enough to notice the page they were on. By this logic, if I've just gone to a bookshop and bought a copy of Grotesque by Natsuo Kirino, I can't crack it open and enjoy the first chapter on the bus ride home because a bunch of teenagers are going to point and laugh at me for performatively reading Japanese feminist crime fiction. I mean, I guess that's theoretically possible, but it seems highly unlikely, all things considered. And that gets to the absurdity of this whole thing. See, by caring about what strangers on the bus think of your reading habits, you have become the thing you supposedly hate. You have become someone who changes your behaviour to perform for an audience. An imaginary audience, to be clear, because other than nerds like me who are nosy about what other book lovers are into, no one actually cares what people are reading on the bus, much less what page they're on. But still, they allow the belief that other people will perceive them to be faking it to change their behaviour, which is itself fake behaviour. Now, it pains me to admit that some of this might be an age thing. Depending on who you ask, I'm either one of the oldest members of Generation Z or one of the youngest members of the millennial generation. And I think, anecdotally, there is a difference between how people older than me think about this stuff and how people younger than me think about it. People older than me largely share my view that the whole concept of being performative or policing others for being performative is too stupid and frivolous to give any airtime to, while a lot of people younger than me seem to be a bit more seriously concerned about getting slapped with that label. I got my first smartphone when I was in about year 11, which for those of you watching from other countries is about 15, 16, and before that I had a phone that could only make calls and texts. That's not me saying, woe is me, I'm Oliver Twist, to be clear. It's just that my brain was allowed to stew a little longer before the internet started polluting it 24/7, instead of just whenever I got the chance to go on the family computer and play Neopets. I was able to form the habit of living for myself before I formed the habit of living for an audience. I sometimes worry that for people younger than me, the opposite is true, that they're living first and foremost for the benefit of others, preemptively avoiding scrutiny and judgment by avoiding any and all behaviour that might be viewed as cringe. But let's face it, we're all cringe. Falling in love is cringe. Dancing to bad music at the club is cringe. Bawling your eyes out at 3 a.m. after reading Charlotte's Web for the first time at age 27 is cringe. And I say that with love, because many of the best human experiences will require you to risk humiliation. Confessing to someone that you like that you have feelings for them involves the risk of rejection, which might be humiliating. Putting some creative work you've done out there in the world risks people not liking it or finding it embarrassing. Learning a foreign language requires you to speak incorrectly with confidence and get corrected by native speakers. Hell, uploading YouTube videos that might never be watched by anyone is on some level embarrassing. But all of these things are worth doing anyway if they bring you joy. Accepting that this is a part of life is an important step towards living in a way that's more true to yourself. Recently, I joined an online community, one which unfortunately has quite a few users that are younger than me by a solid amount, but where the main hobby that connects everyone is reading. People there read a lot, and widely. Everything from the classics to rom-coms to fantasy to erotic fiction. If there's any place that should be immune to these sorts of performativity witch hunts, it should be here. A place where everyone already knows that everyone else is being sincere. But I've noted that quite a few people still say they're afraid of coming across as pretentious, afraid of being perceived as insincere, afraid that their taste is going to be called fake, afraid to read their books in public in case they look performative. Maybe this is just a symptom of getting older, but I find this incredibly stupid and honestly kind of depressing. A product of the way that people younger than me have been raised by the internet, and raised in a world where being perceived as cringe is the worst fate imaginable, because the worst moment of your life might get taken out of context and ripped to shreds in front of an audience of millions. I think that's a sad and bad outcome of the ubiquity of social media, the expectation that everyone participates in this circus. And again, in a great cosmic irony, it means that people are behaving less authentically precisely because they are afraid of being judged for behaving inauthentically. If just being yourself results in being called performative, then the solution is to be less yourself, apparently. I want to tell people that if you really like whatever you like, it doesn't matter if other people think you're pretentious. Just embrace the cringe, my friends. I made a joke in my video on the movie I Saw the TV Glow that I could never be performative because I'm terrible at feigning enthusiasm, and honestly, it wasn't really a joke. You can ask everyone from my primary school reports, to my girlfriend, to my friends, to my university tutors. I struggle to even engage with things that don't interest me, and I have a very low tolerance for even thinking for too long about topics that I find boring. So if you want to say how could someone with a low tolerance for boredom love Shakespeare and Tarkovsky, the answer is that those things just aren't boring to me. If you think that this stuff could never be authentically interesting in the way that, say, Netflix reality TV is, that's a reflection of your worldview, not mine. To expand on a point from the last time I felt the need to yell at clouds, classic fiction and non-American movies and whatever else, like opera, theatre, Shakespeare, is ultimately just entertainment, just like how video games are entertainment, or pop music. Now that might sound like some teacher bullshit, Shakespeare was the Kendrick Lamar of his time type stuff, but it's actually true. A Shakespeare play in the man's own time only cost a penny for the cheapest tickets, and they were popular with a rowdy public that wanted to be entertained, wanted to see a big, dramatic, juicy spectacle. Classics don't become classics because they're boring and serious. They become classics because they're entertaining enough to become beloved, read and reread and reread, to take on new lives in new generations. And yes, there have always been artists who have spoken to smaller and more niche audiences, and some of them have become classics, but again, that's because their work continued to appeal to people for a long time, continued to matter to the people who read it, enough to find new audiences again and again. So the idea that being interested in these works could never be authentic just feels absurd and honestly anti-cultural. Now, I'm not just offended on a personal level that a lot of my own personal interests are the ones that get called performative. I mean, no one ever gets called performatively obsessed with stock tips or football. No, it's only ever reading novels or watching black and white movies that get slapped with this ridiculous label. It's like we're going out of our way to stigmatize behaviors that frankly our society needs more of, like reading and thinking and talking about ideas, and going out of our way not to stigmatize behaviors that we need less of, like posting formulaic word salad on LinkedIn and generating conservative boomer propaganda using slot bots. These behaviors are so unlikable, so cringe, so noxious to the social fabric that they could only be done authentically, whereas reading and self-education are so healthy and beneficial to having a rich inner life that, the logic goes, it might be worthwhile to pretend to enjoy them, maybe to impress hot girls or hot dudes or hot NBs or something. But I also think there's an element of sour grapes here. If you struggle to enjoy certain interests that are coded in our culture as intellectual, like reading, then it's easier to project that everyone who does enjoy those things is just pretending than it is to put the effort in to understand why other people would enjoy them. Remember that when novels were invented, they were seen as lowbrow, trashy entertainment, like TV or movies or video games. Now, the benefits of reading have been scientifically documented. It makes us more imaginative, more empathetic, makes us better writers and conversationalists, but I always say that ultimately those should be secondary to the joy that it gives us. The real mark of a non-performative, authentic reader is joy, and maybe it takes some time to discover that magic, but once you do, it never disappears. Let's put all that aside for a moment, though, and ask the even sillier question of what the material impact of all this supposed performative behaviour really is. Suppose for a second that the caricature of the performative reader is real, that the man on the tube reading Frankenstein somehow is performing for your benefit. Suppose that he doesn't even read Frankenstein and actually has a Colleen Hoover book hidden inside of Frankenstein. Somehow. Why should it make you pay them the attention that, according to your worldview, they are seeking from you by pretending to read Frankenstein? Sure, that person looks silly and insecure, but why care? Surely you have something more interesting to give your attention to. And if not, maybe you need better interests. Because even in the worst case scenario that a performance really is taking place, the only possible impact it could have is to communicate to others that reading Frankenstein is admirable or cool or desirable, thereby normalizing the activity of reading on the tube. In other words, the performative reader, even if they exist, is actually doing a favor to society. Now, to clear up an objection you might have if you've watched this far, I'm definitely not saying that people don't engage in certain behaviors to signal things to others. That would be a crazy claim. When you wear a suit to a job interview, you're being performative by attempting to signal to the interviewers that you're a serious professional. When I write my videos, I'm obviously to a degree performing for the audience that will theoretically watch them, because I hope that that will lead to more people tuning in to watch. When a rich person decorates a space, they tend to decorate it with gaudy and tasteless signifiers of wealth, because they're performatively rich. Humans are, after all, social animals, and it would be impossible and, in fact, undesirable to never think about what our behaviors communicate to other members of society about ourselves. Where I think this whole dynamic gets unhealthy is when we start with the assumption of bad faith. Assume that the conversation we are having through our words and our deeds in public is part of some giant malicious deception. And part of that is the implicit assumption that the activities we think are performative could never be enjoyable. Because really, what I gain from reading on the tube is not a nebulous sense that people will think I'm smart, but, well, entertainment, joy, pleasure. Something that takes my mind off the fact that I'm probably commuting to a lousy job. The internet is, as I said, obsessed with vivisecting the aesthetics and the optics of every single social situation, no matter how trivial or low stakes it may be, and sometimes we get so wrapped up in the semiotic labyrinth of what our tastes or our behaviors signify to others that we forget that people sometimes take actions for their own sake, for their own benefit. In other words, we think that because a copy of Frankenstein might theoretically signify to someone that its reader is cultured and sophisticated, that its only value is as a signifier of culture and sophistication, and that it has no value as a piece of entertainment, which of course is false. Frankenstein's a very good book. Okay, so what am I actually prescribing here? What's my better alternative to policing other people for being performative? Funnily enough, the answer is for the people who call others performative to themselves be less performative. By which I mean they should try to live authentic lives so that when they see other people living authentic lives, they don't feel compelled to snipe and moan that other people are performing for their benefit. I genuinely think they'll be happier as a result. If you perceive a lack of authenticity in society, start by being authentic yourself. Thank you so much for watching. This has been an incredibly performative video, but I figured I just had to take one for the team and finally bury once and for all this absurd conversation. Just kidding. It's another personal vent where I yell at clouds for self-therapy and moan about behaviors that I don't like but don't really matter all that much. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this, and as always, take care of yourselves. Hedgehog out. I really deserve applause for not dedicating more space in this video to explaining the original meaning of performative, because everyone's saying it wrong, but sadly I must bow down to the god of linguistic descriptivism. Bye.